Good morning, guys. Thank you for joining me. Guys, so just before we begin, happy Treason Day to all you Americans. And also, guys, in the UK, we have our national election today. I'm going to do another video on that later on, so I won't dwell on it now. But today, guys, I just want to focus on one article and I want to unpack that for you. Obviously, I'll put the link to it in the description to this video. But guys, nothing is hidden anymore. When we're looking at these large geopolitical moves that seem to come out of nowhere, nothing's hidden. Everything's out there in the open. You just need to know where to look. So this article I'm going to be referring to here, this came out. It's a political article. It's going to be the blueprint for the next 12 months, I feel, and we'll start to see these things happening before the November election in the United States. Again, if Trump gets elected, as I'm sitting here now, I don't see any way that Trump cannot get elected. And if we say that that's a given, then what I'm going to read to you now is going to tell you how things are going to move forward within the next 12 months. And guys, be under no illusion, they are absolutely terrifying. So let's begin, guys. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll unpack that for you. So Trump's plan for NATO is emerging. Donald Trump has threatened to leave NATO so many times, or has appeared to anyway, that for many of his critics is a question of when, not whether. He ditched the 75-year-old alliance if he is re-elected as president in November. The truth, Trump would be unlikely to quit NATO outright, according to interviews with former Trump national security officials and defense experts who are likely to serve in a second term. But even if Trump doesn't formally leave the organization, that doesn't mean NATO would survive a second Trump term intact. So that's just the preface, guys. In return for continued US participation, Trump would not only expect the European countries to drastically increase their spending on NATO, his main complaint when he was president, but also undertake what one defense expert familiar with thinking inside the Trump's national security advisor circle, Dan Coldwell, describes as radical reorientation of NATO. So, guys, what this article's talking about there is if Trump gets elected, and we can pretty much say it's a given at the moment. If Trump gets re-elected, he wants NATO countries to spend more money on their defense systems, and he wants basically a restructuring of NATO. So, and I think this is right because, if you're, for example, if you're in Europe, a lot of European countries who are part of NATO don't meet their 2% GDP spending on defense. Now, you can't have a situation where America is taking all the, taking all the burden of everything, and other countries are not taking any of that burden. Now, the restructure, how does he call it? The radical reorientation of NATO. What as the article is going to explain later, is how we see things panning out in the next 12 months. We don't really have a choice anymore, Caldwell told Politico magazine, citing rising US debt, flagging military recruitment, and a defense industrial base that can't keep up with the challenges from both Russia and China. So those of you who've been watching this channel for a while, guys, I've been saying this conflict that is coming, I don't think anybody can deny it now. It's not going to be like the ones we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, whereby we have light infantry special forces, helicopters, CH-47s, and these light strike attack groups. It's going to be a war of industry, manufacturing, where the more stuff you can get from your factories, logistically, transported to the front lines, that's the kind of winning, they're the wins that are going to happen. Now, Russia's military-industrial complex, they're on a war economy in Russia. Guys, what do you think about the Chinese production capacity? Is it good? Is it bad? I think anybody who says that China can't produce stuff, they're in a fantasy land. And what Russia is doing, they're producing cheap stuff quickly. And as you've seen in this conflict in Ukraine, the expensive stuff gets used up very, very quickly. And then what's left then? Once all that expensive stuff's gone and you can't get the components, you can't get the circuit boards, you can't get the transistors, the resistors, the little tiny parts that you used to use a supplier, and then that supplier went bust because the raw materials were too expensive and they weren't. You see where I'm going, guys, all right? This technologically advanced equipment is better, but when it's gone because the amount of multinational effort to make that work becomes very difficult. We've done that. Neither Trump nor his campaign has yet named a new national security team, or openly embraced a new agenda for NATO. The campaign did not respond to several requests for comment to this article, but former officials and experts who spoke for this article, some on the record, some on condition of anonymity. I always question that anonymity thing, but I think in this article, some of the things they talk about, I think they've got good sources, are engaged in an ongoing debate within the Trump world over how hard to push the Europeans towards security architecture more to Trump's liking. According to these officials, the US would keep its nuclear umbrella over Europe during the second Trump term by maintaining its air power bases in Germany, England, and Turkey. And its naval, I think there's an air base in Scotland actually. And its naval forces as well. Meanwhile, the bulk of the infantry, armour, logistics, artillery would ultimately pass from American to European hands. Part of this plan were floated in an article published in February 2003 by the Trump-affiliated Center for Renewing America. But in months since, there has been an emerging and more detailed consensus among Trump supporters on an outlined new concept for NATO. So what they're saying is here, they're going to keep the air bases, the naval bases, and the equipment that's already in Europe. So kind of like they left a load of equipment in Afghanistan. I know it's a bad, analogy, but the equipment that I think they're going to keep in Europe, they're just going to leave it, not kind of abandon it, but leave it there for Europeans to use. Again, this is going to be a good move for America because there's going to be servicing, there's going to be spare parts, there's going to be all sorts of infrastructure that's going to be needed to make that equipment work. And that's going to be money, going back to America. Picture of what's happening? Picture of Schultz there and Joe Biden. I wonder if Joe Biden remembers that sitting there. The shift they envision would involve significantly and substantially downsizing America's security role, stepping back instead of being the primary provider of combat power in Europe. Somebody who provides support only in terms of crisis. And guys, this is what should be happening. If you live in Europe, we need to put our big boy pants on and stop asking America to come and save us. I've said this many, many, many times. And as well, what we're seeing is, remember, we're seeing these diversions now, and the article actually talks about it, not in the exact same words as I do, but the article does come on to later about these diversions. But guys, they're right. Europe has to take responsibility for Europe. Where did I go there? Yeah, in times of crisis, who recently served as a senior advisor to Russell Vought, the former senior Trump administration official who in May was named policy director for the Republican National Convention, who is expected to play a senior role in Trump's second term administration. Again, guys, look at the language here, guys, right? They're not even talking like if Trump wins. They're talking about he's going to serve in Trump's second role. It's kind of a done deal already in America, I feel. That is another part of the emerging Trump game plan is a two-tier NATO system. That idea, first proposed by another senior former Trump administration official, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. Guys, I think this is the same guy, Keith Kellogg, and I've not looked into it, But as I understand, Keith Kellogg with two other retired generals, I think it was KBR, Kellogg, Brown, and something else. I think it's like Riley. They set up a company called KBR. Now, KBR started off as a company that provided food to the US military. What they did, I think it was two American and a British general. They set up a private company when they were generals, lieutenant generals. They set up this private company. As I understand it, guys, I'm maybe slightly wrong with the particulars, but I think it's this guy. They set up a private company. They then awarded that private company a contract to supply food to US military bases overseas. Then they got out of the military, and then they've now got that company. Think of what you want of that, guys. What I will say, that company, as I understand it, has now advanced, and they now build drones and more offensive systems rather than just food and water. But anyway, that's a little backstory. Retired Army General Keith Kellogg means that member countries that have not yet met their target of spending 2% GDP on defence wouldn't enjoy defence largesse and defence security guarantees of the United States. Guys, remember a couple of videos back when I identified, what did I say? I said you've got Finland, you've got Latvia, Estonia, Poland, you've got those Baltic regions. I said these areas are areas of high concern because they border Russia, and there'll be lots of little border towns on that border where Putin could push his troops, push his spies in there. And I'm talking about the ones with tuxedos and expensive watches now. He could push a few of those in there, start paying a local militia to say that they're being persecuted by the nationals, say that the ethnic Russians want to be part of Russia, and then these are the small towns that could be annexed by Putin. Now, if those countries are not spending their 2% GDP, then by this article, and what we're seeing is if Putin annexed a part of that NATO country, then the United States would say, listen, guys, you guys don't pay your 2%. We're not coming to help you. And guys, this might be an unpopular opinion, but that has to happen, in the sense that if you're part of a gang and you have to pay 2% GDP on defense, don't ask to join that gang if you're not going to spend that money on defense. It's like if you join a club and they say, right, you need to pay £5 a month, and you say, yeah, I want to join your club, but I don't want to pay £5 a month. I want everybody else to pay it. You say, no, you can't join this club. It's ridiculous. We can't do that. We can't keep supporting you. So what I would like to think is that more countries will start spending their 2% GDP. And guys, this should be a floor. This should be the minimum effort, especially where we are now, because we've had something called the peace dividend, where after the collapse of the Soviet Union, people stopped spending as much money on defense. Where are we? I forgot where I was. Yeah, 2% on defense. Yeah, wouldn't enjoy the security guarantee of the United States. According to one Trump-aligned national security expert who spoke on conditions of anonymity to describe internal discussions. This could be seen... Here we are, guys. This could be seen to be in defiance of Article 5 of the treaty, which obliges every member to take such action it deemed necessary to assist whoever is attacked. But the Trump Foreign Policy Brain Trust noted that the language in Article 5 is flexible. So basically what they're saying there is, guys, they're not going to respect this Article 5. And guys, I've said this so many times. Article 5, it's fine and it's great and it's a piece of paper and we love pieces of paper. The reality is, if there is an Article 5 issue, somebody at some level has to then tell their troops to go. And that becomes the problem then. Who's going to do that? Who's going to send them? For what reasons? Can you imagine starting a third world war? How the optics of starting a third world war over, and again, I don't want to speak negative, but this is how it would look. over a town on the Latvian, on the Estonian, but a town on the Estonian border, who for the last 6 months there's been protests, there's been an outcry of people wanting to become part of Russia. The town's, I don't know, say the town is 5 kilometers wide or something, a small town. Are we really going to send nuclear bombers into that region and risk a third world war over this? Guys, it really is a game of cat and mouse at the moment. But look at the way they're using the language now, guys, okay? They're talking about about flexibility in Article 5. So that kind of means that they're not gonna listen to it, and they're not gonna pay attention to it. What has just happened? It's all going mad. It's all going crazy. There we are. Trump has consistently expressed piquet to NATO allies, rip us off by not meeting the 2% spending target. And he's right, literally what I've just said, if you're not spending what you're supposed to, then you are ripping the United States off, who do take the bulk of NATO. Most recently, Trump actually appeared to invite a Russian attack against NATO deadbeats, saying he'd encourage the Russians to do whatever the hell they want with member countries that have not yet met the defence spending target, a decade after the NATO allies pledged to do so in their 2014 summit in Wales. So guys, again, if people are saying they're going to spend 2% of GDP and they don't, they are literally just laughing at the United States, because it's kind of like, imagine you and your neighbour decide to have a joint fence. You live next to your neighbour and you decide to put up a joint fence because you live near shops and kids keep coming on your gardens. So your neighbour doesn't earn as much as you. So you say, hey, listen, you know what? I earn a lot more than you, so I will do this much, but can you do that much? Which is in proportion, 2%, which is in proportion, and you've already agreed on it, okay? So you put your fence up, your neighbour's left this fence wide open, and the kids keep coming on. And you say, hey, buddy, I asked you to do this. I asked you to do this fence. Can you do it? 10 years ago, he says, yeah, we'll do it. And 10 years later, he's still not put this fence up. And the kids keep coming on your garden, and there's rubbish everywhere. And then you say, listen, dude, you're kind of ripping me off here. What I'm going to do is, I'm just going to fence my own garden off and leave you to it. And then your neighbour complaining, saying, oh, but you said you was going to... No, we came to an agreement of 2%. If you're not coming to the agreement, then, let the kids do what they want, because you're not paying your fair share. And guys, we should have to pay our fair share. A swift resolution of the 2.5-year conflict would also likely play a role in Trump's plan for NATO, as part of a plan for Ukraine that has not been previously reported. Presumptive GOP nominee is mulling a deal whereby NATO commits to no further eastward expansion, specifically into Ukraine and Georgia, and negotiates with Russian President Vladimir Putin over how much Ukrainian territory Moscow can keep, according to 2 other Trump-aligned national security experts. Guys, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but this is, we can't really have a situation where might is right. I don't know the solution, but we just can't have it where Russia can decide to take huge swaths of another country because it feels like it. I don't get the provocation argument. I don't accept it. We are where we are. And I feel when Trump gets elected, he's going to be pushing for this. But then don't forget, there's going to be NATO allies who are going to take up that slack. So I don't know how far this is actually going to go. It'd be very easy for Trump to try and push to this. It's all going to be smoke and mirrors for what we'll come on to later. We've got some, I think, Romanian soldiers. Altogether, Trump's new approach in these areas would amount to a revolution in NATO's affairs, and it needs one. One of the many critics say Europe is wholly incapable of accomplishing in the foreseeable future. The US is by far the largest contributor of NATO operations, spending about 860 billion US dollars on defense. That represents 68% of the total expenditure of NATO countries in 2023. That is well over 10 times more than that of Germany, the second largest spending country. A substantial proportion of that US expenditure, which amounts to about 3.5% GDP, goes on defense of Europe though the Pentagon refuses to divulge publicly how much, says Jeremy Shapiro, research director of the European Council on Foreign Affairs. Yeah, so I think the Pentagon are refusing to divulge how much they spend because I don't think they know, because there's a lot of different pockets and pots, and it becomes very difficult to understand where the spending is. But again, we've got America now propping up Europe, and America are spending 10 times more on defense than the largest European contributor. This model can't continue. And I mean that with someone who wants to keep the NATO model, of someone who feels it should be kept, it's so corrupted, and it's so, they're not spending enough. People really need to understand, and not just spend more, spend better. Meeting with President Joe Biden in Washington, and again, guys, I don't think Joe Biden's got any credibility in this, but we'll go with it. Meeting with President Joe Biden in Washington earlier this month, outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced that 23 of the 31 non-US NATO members will now make the alliance's 2% target. That's more than twice as many as 4 years ago. Stoltenberg said, "This is expected to include Germany for the first time since the 1990s. Guys, that's disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. And the country's hawkish defence minister, Boris Pistorius, appears eager to do better, calling for Germany to shoot up to 3.5% of GDP on defence. You see, if we had kept spending 2% regular on GDP, we probably wouldn't on defense, we probably wouldn't be in this situation at the moment, because if you look strong, nobody wants to attack you. But the reality is, defense is always one that gets cut. Look, in the UK, we've had defense cuts and cuts and cuts. I've started a petition to get soldiers a better pay rise. I've had to. I really try hard to get more for our soldiers, for the actual people who are doing the work, and I'll talk about that later, actually. But even if Germany hits that mark, some Trump-aligned former defence officials say it's not nearly enough. I'm in favour of sustaining the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO. But I think the only way to do that, and I tell this to the Europeans all the time, is for them to assume a lot more of the burden, said Elbridge Colby. They have some cool names. Who led the development of Trump's national defense strategy in his Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Strategy and Force Development. Wow, that's a title. And who is said to be in line for a senior position in a post-Trump second administration. So, what they're saying there is, guys, what I've said for a long time. Europe needs to take up more of this slack. Europe needs to do more, and we do. We can't be doing 10 times what the Germans are doing anymore. We've got to be prepared to be tough with them. There's got to be consequences, Colby said in an interview. We want NATO to be active, but we want it to be with the Europeans in the lead. That was the original idea that That was Dwight Eisenhower's idea. Only now, faced with a menacing China, the need for making such changes is more urgent, Colby said. The United States does not have enough military forces to go round. We can't break our spear against the Russians in Europe when we know the Chinese and Russians are collaborating, and the Chinese are more are a more dangerous and significant threat. Guys, what have I been saying for the longest time? What have I said? Back in December, I said it, guys. I said, listen, whatever the next phase of whatever we're living through is, you're going to see it in February. And I got a lot of flack because people were saying, "Oh, Sean, you said that World War III would start in February," and I didn't. I said you would see the breadcrumbs, the seeds. And what have I been talking about for the longest time? I've been talking about this diversions. I have, guys. I've been talking about the United States not wanting to commit in Europe because of the threat of China. They can't do it. They've learned lessons from Iraq, from Afghanistan. When you spread yourself too thin, you can't really achieve much. So this here, guys, I'll read it again. We can't break our spear in Europe against the Russians. Literally what I've been saying. And look at all the paths that are being set out from us now, guys. Look at the negativity and the rhetoric towards NATO and Europe. That's being pushed. And guys, it's going to be, it's kind of smoke and mirrors, because as long as if Trump's president and he's saying we want a ceasefire in Ukraine, we want parts of the Donbass to be Russian, we want Crimea to be Russian, then America is not a threat to Russia. It's kind of like playing paper, scissors, stone. If America's not a threat to Russia, Russia won't attack America. Fine. So then America could be in a conflict with China. So then America's kind of played the game that they're not getting attacked from Russia, but they're getting attacked from China and they're at war with China. And then you've got a situation where Europe and NATO, and I think it's going to be led by the United Kingdom, are going to be at war with Russia in Europe. And you see how neither side, how that fits into the, that fits into the equation there, guys. Yeah, we've done that. And then we've got a picture of Jans on some sort of podium. Remember what I said as well about this switch and bait thing? And I didn't realize he was changing his role. You get these things where people, they give the rhetoric and then they leave. They give the rhetoric, then they leave. And that's what you found with Jan Stoltenberg. I continue. Some of the Trump-aligned experts are mostly focused on spending issues, while others want European countries to both spend more and assume far more of the military burden. Kieran Skinner, Trump's former policy planning chief under Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and a key player in Project 2025, an exhaustive agenda for Trump's second term, emphasizes the need for more European spending as a starting point. We need to right-size America's role in the world in the 21st century. And that's what I think this is about, she said. The US is not the world's ATM machine. And that you can't argue with that. America's got its own problems. America's got its own problems that America needs to deal with. NATO has a significant contribution to make in the Atlantic theatre and the Indo-Pacific theatre, but we need to do more strategic thinking on both sides. So what she's basically saying there is, you guys deal with Europe, we'll deal with the Pacific, i.e. China. The first test of Trump's NATO intentions, should he win another term, would be, so I think they've got two writers here. The first test of Trump's intentions, should he win another term, would be how he handles Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. Now remember what we've said about this diversions. The US has stepped up its central role in NATO since the Ukraine war began, sending additional 20,000 troops to Europe, making for a total of 100,000. In addition to new air, land, maritime, cyber, and space capabilities, according to the two Trump-aligned national security experts familiar with the thinking inside Trump's inner circle. The prospective GOP nominee is now considering making a deal with Putin on which countries could join NATO, particularly Ukraine and Georgia. Such a plan would scuttle NATO's vague promise of future membership to Ukraine, a policy that Biden has continued, albeit without committing to a timeline. So, in a recent article, it came out that Ukraine's going to be told at some point that it's too corrupt to join NATO. So if that's already a done deal, what they're saying here doesn't really matter. But what is important is is what they're talking about. So this is what Putin wants. What we've just said there is kind of what Putin wants. But if we've got the rest of NATO saying no, we're not gonna, we're not gonna let the Ukrainians falter. We want the 1991 borders, and then America publicly saying, "Hey guys, listen, you know what? We're not spending any more money on Ukraine." Then America is not a target. Then, if future conflict breaks out on a global stage, America's not a Russian target. That frees America up. Remember what we just said, to deal with any Indo-Pacific threat. So that's kind of like the way we're going now. And all the rhetoric seems to be heading towards that. And guys, I've been saying this for the longest time. In April, the Washington Post reported that Trump's tentative plan also involves pressing Ukraine to cede Crimea and the Donbass border region to Russia. So remember, guys, this is just rhetoric that Trump's putting in, and it's for smoke and mirrors, because it doesn't matter if Washington, if the United States say that. The only people who can really decide this are the people of Ukraine. And if they're getting more help from NATO, from the NATO allies in Europe, which they're pushing, then it doesn't matter. All this does is free America up from conflict with Russia. I would expect a very quick deal to end the conflict, said Kevin Roberts. I thought that was Trump then. I was going to say, I would expect a very quick deal to end the conflict. But anyway, said Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation of influential Trump-aligned think tank that has produced Project 25. Roberts said in an interview that he could convey no inside knowledge of Trump's plans. But according to one of the national security experts familiar with Trump's thinking, speaking of condition of anonymity, and I do actually think this is legit, Trump would be open to something foreclosing NATO expansion and not going back to the 1991 borders for Ukraine. That would be on the table, but that doesn't mean surrendering any other possibility, including supplying large amounts of weapons to Ukraine. So look at the contradiction here. Well, not contradiction, but look at the framework that they're setting out now. In the first part of this article, they're saying that Europe needs to take a more of an active role, and America needs to lay off what's happening in Europe. So if that happens, Trump can give as much rhetoric about not supporting Ukraine, about not giving any weapons to Ukraine and wanting this. The reality is that's going to continue to move forward, because Trump's already going to pull out of, potentially pull out of funding for NATO and funding for Ukraine. But remember, before that happens, there's going to be a lot more NATO funding going in. So it's just a restructuring. I think the first sentence said it, a reevaluation of NATO structure. Trump himself has not publicly detailed his plans for Ukraine, but on the campaign trail, he repeatedly vowed to end the war as one of his first tasks. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, shortly after we win the presidency, he declared at a June 22nd rally in Philadelphia. Asked on June 21 podcast whether he was willing to take NATO expansion into Ukraine off the table, Trump replied, in remarks that went largely unreported, that promising NATO membership to Ukraine had been a mistake, and really why this war started. Many in the Trump campaign openly prefer non-NATO Ukraine. NATO has already expanded well beyond what was needed for anti-hegemonic coalition against Russia, said Colby. So what they're talking about there is, and remember, guys, all right, it's already a done deal that for the foreseeable future, Ukraine can't join NATO because of corruption. So what he's saying there, the rhetoric that they're saying is stuff that's already been agreed under the weeds. So whereas Trump comes out and he says it big and bold and it makes headlines, he's kind of not saying anything that's not already been agreed at a lower level. We're almost there, guys. We're almost there. On June 14th, so very recently, Putin said Russia would be ready to negotiate an end to the war if Ukraine renounced any ambition to join NATO and withdrew troops from the 4 regions that Moscow had claimed its own. Asked in his 27th of June debate with Biden if such terms were acceptable, Trump said, "No, they're not acceptable, but look at this war that never should have happened." So, Trump's so right, and he gets things so right. This situation is not acceptable. We just can't have. Bring this back to wherever you live, in the UK, in the US, in Australia, wherever. You can't have a situation where your neighbour is big and hard, he goes to the gym, he's a black belt in jiu-jitsu and all the rest of it, where he can just decide to take half of your garden. You just can't have it. And these laws, these international laws, need to be fractal in the sense that something that happens on a global scale, if we say it's wrong, that needs to fractalize down to a domestic scale. So, can you imagine if, Putin takes this part of Ukraine and everybody just accepts it, then I go and take my neighbour's garden. And when they say you can't take that, I'll say, oh, no, I can. And then you just cite whatever law Putin cited or whatever, you just say, look, this is a precedence here on an international scale. Laws have to be fractal or there's no point in having them. And we have to defend those laws. Again, if we don't defend the laws, what's the point in having them? Critics say pressuring Ukraine to surrender territory would only vindicate Putin's horrific and murderous land grab. It would. But Trump has made it clear he has little love for Ukraine as he does for NATO, telling House Speaker Mike Johnson during his visit to Capitol Hill in June that Ukraine is never going to be there for us. So what he's saying is, right, and again, Trump is for, as I understand it, Trump is for Americans, and every world leader should be for their own people, but with the NATO alliance, you're kind of making an alliance for your own protection as well. And, Trump is for Americans. So, he's right in what he's saying. I don't feel there's any scenario or situation where Ukraine is going to come to the aid of America. Here we go, guys. Ukraine is never going to be there for us, and we should pay our troops more instead of sending 60 billion to Ukraine. Guys, I have said this so many times. I said it at the beginning of this video. When I was standing as a reform candidate, I used to say to them, look, guys, one of the main things I want a 30% pay increase for our soldiers, not more money spent on defense, which they get nothing. I want money to be given to our soldiers so they can spend it on whatever they want. Guys, it's a travesty, the pay situation with our military, especially in the UK. According to a tweet from Republican Rep Matt Gaetz, another GOP representative, Don Bacon told reporters in recounting the same conversation that Trump was dismissive of Kiev's goal of driving out the Russians, which has been Biden's unstinting policy. He's like, if Ukraine wins, what will be the benefit? Bacon said. Yeah. So again, Trump's seeing this he's looking at this as objectively as he can. He's saying, right, okay, if Ukraine wins, and what does a win mean, guys? All right, what does a win mean? Does a win mean back to the 1991 borders? Does a win mean back to the 1991 borders and a 10-mile buffer zone? What does a win mean? Because it's very unclear to me at this point what an actual, what a win actually means. So But that's how Trump's focusing that, and that's how he's identifying it. Who's that? I don't know that guy. He looks cool. The biggest issue, let me see how much more I've got. The biggest issue with Trump's emerging approach to NATO may be that the European nations are plainly not prepared to fill a dramatically expanded military role anytime soon. So remember what we've just said about Trump saying openly that he doesn't support the Ukrainian role. And that's fine. But what he's also doing is giving more capability and capacity to the Europeans. So the Europeans can support Ukraine in the same capacity that the United States did without the United States doing it. So guys, this divergence is happening and we're seeing it in real time. Despite their tentative plans for Trump-proofing NATO by pledging more spending, experts say, but they may have little choice since Trump would have more leverage to demand what he wants from Europe this time around because the US is still supplying the lion's share of military aid to Ukraine. And Europe is weaker economically and more dependent on US energy supplies than ever before. Guys, what I think could happen, and I think it would be absolutely brilliant for America, if America just stopped exporting their oil and their energy. America is a net exporter. So for America, what I think they should do, and again, this will be rubbish for the rest of the world, but for America, I think it's an option to just say, look, you know what? We've got problems in our own country. We need to make America strong again. We need to build the economy. We're going to stop exporting oil. So that would mean that the oil would be used internally. That would drive down the prices of everything in America because everything comes from energy. People don't understand this. Everything comes from energy. With a free, unlimited, clean supply of energy, there would be no wars. So if America stopped exporting oil, they would lower their own energy costs, which would increase production. It would increase GDP. It would make America it would make America a lot better. European leaders are in denial. Many US critics say they don't really have any idea of how to replace the United States, says Shapiro of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Fitful efforts by French President Macron to push more independence from the US defense umbrella have fallen flat. Stoltenberg, in the final months of his 10-year term as NATO Secretary General, has taken to arguing that Americans ought to be satisfied that European defense is helping sustain the US defense industry. They've decided to have abiding faith that the US will be there, said Shapiro. It seems to me that's not really a plan. It's the hope that you have in the absence of a plan. So it is, guys, what he's saying there is the Europeans hope that the United States will come to their aid, even though a lot of them are not paying 2% GDP, even though a lot of them are not providing the military commitment that they're supposed to. And, if you're one of these border towns, what are we talking? Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, you kind of need to be spending your GDP, your 2% GDP. Critics in the Trump camp say the Europeans need to develop cross-border defense industries rather than national ones to increase efficiency and capacity and deliver on a still unfulfilled pledge to vastly expand NATO's quick response force from 40,000 to some 300,000 troops. Guys, that is a gigantic number of troops to have in a quick response force. But with the exception of some countries like Poland, many European governments remain borderline delusional about what is required, says Caldwell. And a lot of these countries, they get into NATO and they don't spend what they were supposed to spend. So they are, in that context, they are delusional. For his part, Trump continues to be coy about any details for Europe and NATO. However, as part of his campaign Agenda 47 platform, Trump said in a video post in March that we have finished the process. We have to finish the process we began under my administration of fundamentally re-evaluating NATO's purpose and NATO's mission. Trump also recently told Nigel Farage, good old Farage gets a mention, his far-right British supporter, I wouldn't say, his far-right, Trump's not, Farage is not far-right. His far-right British supporter that the US will 100% remain in NATO under his leadership as long as European countries play fair. So all the time, guys, you're seeing this language, you're seeing this rhetoric where, America wants Europe to deal with Europe, which is totally fair. While America, remember what they said, don't want to break their spear in Europe when China is an emerging threat. You're seeing this rhetoric, guys, and now you can get yourself in this mindset. All these little footsteps you see are going to make that diversions more. But guys, it's only going to be a diversions on paper for reasons we previously mentioned. For his part, Trump... No, I've done that. Vaught, the new GOP Convention Policy Director and former Director of the Office of Management and Budget during the Trump administration, is a hard-right nationalist who believes the main threat is China. I just said it, guys, Vaught, who is and he's right. Vaught, who is considering a likely candidate for the Chief of Staff in a second Trump term, did not respond to an interview request. But, according to associates familiar with his thinking, Vaught also believes that Washington should play a more dormant role in NATO, along the lines of the recommendations by Sumantra Mitra, the analyst at Vaught's Center for Renewing America, who wrote that in an influential article this year. So remember, guys, everything we're saying now, it's kind of the same thing that I was saying back in December. Robert says a flood of worried Europeans have come through their heritage in recent months, fretting about what might happen under a Trump presidency. Of course they're threatening, they need to spend. And us in the UK as well, we need to spend more. There have been meetings with 2 or 3 ambassadors I had of allies, and these are great countries, who just don't get it, he said. They don't get that you can't come to the United States from Europe and say, you must give us money because Putin's going to invade our country. You can't disagree with that statement. Let me read it again. They just don't get that you can't come to the United States from Europe and say, you must give us money because Putin's going to invade our country. You can't disagree with that. The American taxpayer says, what have you done? What has Germany done? Why do they continue to buy Russian natural gas? Yeah, fix your own backyard before you come to us for handouts. So Germany's industrial complex was built on cheap Russian gas. Germany was in a very particular situation. So again, guys, that's gone now. There's no more cheap Russian gas for Germany. And, German heavy manufacturing's kind of gone. Remember what we just said. Everything comes from energy. So the reason German manufacturing was so, it was so stable was because of the cheap gas that they got from Russia. Now, use Germany as an example because they've just mentioned them. You can't have a situation where, I don't know, let me change this. Imagine your garden again. You've got, your neighbor is complaining that these kids keep coming on their garden and messing about and doing whatever. You've got a shared garden, so you agree to have a shared fence. But your neighbor, he's not putting his new fence up, and he's buying cheap knockoff goods off these kids. So, and you're like, neighbor, listen, mate, what do you want? Do you want to be part of our alliance, or do you want cheap knockoff goods? Because you can't have it both ways. So you see, the Europeans who have been reliant on cheap Russian gas and also want to be part of NATO, which is you see where we're going, guys, okay? You're seeing these diversions, you're seeing this decoupling from East versus West. And, and then, so further to that analogy, so you're buying cheap knockoff goods, and then when they come on your garden, that when the kids come on his garden again, he comes knocking at your door saying, "Oh, please get the kids off. They're on the garden again." And you're like, "Dude, listen, you're buying cheap knockoff goods off them kids. You're not paying your 2%, and every time they come and trash your garden, you're asking me to clean up." No. You see where we're going, guys? This is what's happening on a geopolitical stage. Germany stopped directly importing Russian gas after Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, but Germany's second and third largest suppliers of natural gas, the Netherlands and Belgium, reportedly still import significant quantities of liquid natural gas from Russia's Yamal LNG project. As Trump's disaffected former national security advisor, John Bolton, wrote in his memoir, The Room Where It Happened, Trump was continually peeved by the issue while president. At the news conference with Stoltenberg in 2018, NATO summit, Trump fulfillment, we're supposed to protect you, and yet you're paying all this money to Russia. Think about the analogy I just said, guys. All right, you can't argue with what he's saying because he's right. And then Germany's like, yes, but we want very cheap. That's not German accent. Yeah, but we want cheap motoring industry. I feel like they're almost going through the stages of grief in Europe, Colby says. They moved past rejection to a sort of acceptance, but they haven't gotten yet to, okay, here's how we deal with this. Yeah. I think there is significant movement, but it's too slow and too little. Well, guess what? You know when Trump stops all the funding, they're going to spend a lot more, a lot quick. I do think there's a significant movement, but it's too slow. What just happened? Yeah, I do think there's a significant movement, but it's too slow and too little. They need to be producing combat credible forces to deal with a Russian attack, like now. They're giving themselves a pat on the back for doing what they do. They're giving a pat on the back for what they should have been producing 10 years ago. Yeah, so what they're talking about there is what I spoke about right at the beginning of this video. They need to be producing stuff that's combat effective, that's combat ready. They don't need to be paying $100,000 a year to a professor in a university to sit there and think about, existential threats that may or may not happen and how we can use technology, to defeat them. Europe needs to be producing stuff. We need trucks, we need tanks, we need things that go bang. And that's the reality. What I would do, I would say, right, we can't defeat Russians with tanks, so I would go for trucks. I would go for fast mobile trucks with anti-tank capability. I'm of a light infantry background, fast-moving advanced infantry, so I would always favour that option because it's very difficult for tanks, and they're a lot cheaper to build trucks. It's very difficult for tanks to identify and track a fast-moving target. And especially when there's a lot of them. Even worse, ground-based infantry, as you saw in the initial conflict in Ukraine. Even some former Trump officials, even some former Trump officials acknowledge that Washington probably doesn't want to go too far in handing over leadership to the Europeans. So, Trump, the US would keep a shadow presence there, I feel. Trump's isolationist instincts could accidentally boomerang and lure the US into a wider war. I think that's the way we're heading anyway, guys. We're heading to a wider war. Colby, for one, points with concern to Macron's suggestion of putting French troops into the Ukraine conflict and some of the provocative rhetoric coming out of the more hawkish East European leaders. Among them, Latvia's president, who recently declared in Latin, Russia delenda est, which was inviction of Cato's prescription for ancient Carthage delenda est, which means Carthage must be destroyed. So the Latvian president is saying Russia must be destroyed. Russia must be destroyed. They have 6,000 nuclear weapons. The blithe way some people are approaching the escalation issues is just insane to me, Colby says. I'm very worried that and the possibility that we might get chain ganged into a larger war with Russia by such imprudent steps. I don't really give credibility to this 6,000 nuclear weapons number. You know, a lot of these were built in the Cold War, and you know, fissionable material degrades over time. So I'd really be questionable about how many they actually have. And remember, it's not how many nuclear weapons you have; it's how many nuclear weapons you can deploy. Beyond that, Trump's pledge to not expand NATO may be far more palatable to European allies than many people realise, and I think he's right. So remember what we just brought out about, Ukraine to be told, well, Zelensky to be told that Ukraine is too corrupt to join NATO. So it's kind of, they're rewashing old stuff that's already happened and making it sound new and fresh. In May, Chancellor Olaf Scholz was blunt in saying he didn't think Ukraine could be part of NATO for perhaps 30 years. And on June 17th, Stoltenberg indicated that a ceasefire wouldn't be enough to set NATO membership for Ukraine in motion. We have to be certain that there is peace and not just a pause, he said. We need assurances that is the end and it stops there. So, as part of NATO membership, you can't be in an active war with somebody, which Ukraine is. So all the rhetoric, it kind of doesn't make any sense because there's an active war, and it's quite clear that you can't join NATO if you're in an active war. I mean, look at Trump's hair. He's got fantastic hair. But a new Trump administration, even in the most hopeful case, is likely to be jarring to the Atlantic Alliance. Many US officials, including General Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, I want to be the Supreme Allied Commander of something, insist that 2% should be a floor, not a ceiling for the Europeans. So what he's saying, let me read the rest actually. And they note that Barack Obama, among other US presidents, chronically complained about European free riders, which is why Obama insisted of the 2% target in Wales 2014. I think in 2014, when Obama went to Wales for this NATO summit, I think he just turned up at Stonehenge with the whole of his entourage. So what they're saying there is basically, 2% should be the minimum. And what I would add is we need to, because a lot of countries are clever how they spend it. They spend it on things back for themselves, so they're not really for defense. I say it should be 2% minimum on lethality equipment. So you can't buy, you can't buy a fleet of ferries and claim their dual role for the military in case they need a military ferry service. But then you're using them as a commercial system as well. So, you know what I mean, guys? That needs to be, I think that needs to be 2% on lethality. Minimum 2% on lethality. According to one senior European diplomat who spoke on condition of anonymity, the EU governments are. Let me just quickly, I used to work for the EU in Baghdad, the EU delegation. And one of the things we were talking, and they predicted somebody who I was, we'll call him Ernie. Ernie was a British diplomat, and he would identify little things. It was kind of a mentor to me, and he would identify things in the weeds, and he would say, look at that there, that's going to grow, and he'd explain to me how things would bloom, and it was always fascinating to me to listen to him. One of the things he said when our contract was ready to be renewed, he said, if this contract doesn't get, this was before Farage's Brexit campaign, he said, if this contract that we're on doesn't get renewed, Britain is going to leave the European Union. He said he didn't know what the mechanism was, but that's what he said. And the contract didn't get renewed. I still kept in touch with him, and I still keep in touch with him now. And then we had the Brexit thing, and it happened. And it just shows you how these little weeds in fires little weeds in the shrubs. If you identify what they are, you can understand the geopolitical spectrum. You know what's coming well ahead of time and well ahead of anybody else. So, according to one senior European diplomat who spoke on condition of anonymity, the EU governments are actually aware of this. It's difficult to assess whether they will be able to do enough to really placate Trump because we find it hard to predict what he will or will not do. The diplomat said, Europe also recognizes that China could have an impact on the military role the US would be able to play, helping to protect Europe. There may not be enough capacity for two theatres. Guys, I literally said this back in December. America can't break its shield in Europe if they're looking for a scrap with the Chinese. And that kind of, encapsulates everything there. The US would be able to play in helping protect Europe. There may not be enough capacity for two theatres. You can't argue with that, guys. So if people in America know that it's a done deal, that they're going to war with China, then they physically can't commit all their troops into Europe. And all these things, you're going to see all these pathways, you're going to see, negotiations and summits and all the rest of the jazz. It doesn't matter. I'm telling you what's happening now. In the end, only Trump can say how far he will go in upending NATO. Let me just quickly on this, guys, as well. It's UK election day today. We don't have a system like America. America, you do vote for your president, and then your president can come in, he can sign executive orders, he can make decisions, he can get things done. In the United Kingdom, like what we're going to have in the United Kingdom is we're going to have loads of people voting for reform. So reform is like, it's like a fringe right-wing, not far right, it's like a fringe right-wing party led by Nigel Farage. And there's going to be loads of votes for reform, but unless Nigel Farage wins his seat, he won't be able to do anything. So even if Nigel Farage wins his seat, his capacity in government will be limited because he's just one person. And the British system is set up by you vote for your local, whoever you want to represent you on a local level. Those guys get elected. They have to form a government. They have to produce a leader. That leader will then lead that party. And then you have an opposition who forms together and a leader of the opposition who will then form, and come together. So it's very difficult in the UK to have a Trump-style leadership, which is, you could argue it's more of in the United States, it's more of a dictatorate, a dictator light than in the United Kingdom. In the end, only Trump can say how far he will go in upending NATO. Bolton told Politico in February that Trump's goal is not to strengthen NATO, it's to lay the groundwork to get out. But remember, guys, smoke and mirrors. If Russia thinks America wants to get out of NATO and they're pulling all their funding from Europe, then America straight away is not a target for Russia, which leaves America to have one enemy in the Indo-Pacific theatre. But most former Trump officials appear to believe the alliance should be preserved. So do I. And they're already claiming credit for preserving it thanks to Trump's ultimatums to NATO. They argue that Obama only complained about Europe's stringiness. Trump actually did something about it. Trump's last national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, in a newly published essay in Foreign Affairs, writes that his pressure on NATO governments to spend more on defence actually made the alliance stronger. Hundreds of billions of extra additional money went into NATO contributions. Partly as a result, said Skinner, I'm very optimistic about positive future for NATO if it gets the foundation right. And again, I will also caveat that it's not just spending the money, you have to be spending it in the right areas. Whether the foundation is right may be in the eye of the beholder. If the benchmark is hitting a 2% spending target, Europe may be on track to become an alliance that Trump will stay in. But As his advisors made clear, if Trump enters the Oval Office for a second time, it seems likely that just delivering 2% GDP won't be enough. In other words, Trump's national security goalposts may be moving. Just how far is not clear, but the future of NATO and Europe rests on the answer. So I think what they could claim there is, guys, listen, we needed to be spending 2% GDP in times of peace. We don't have times of peace anymore. We have this, this well, it's not even an emerging Russian threat. It is a Russian threat. Russia is in a war economy right now. They're producing lots of stuff. So I'd say that what we could see is when Trump gets in, he'll say, right, 2% is the peacetime spending, should be the peacetime spending. I want 3%, whatever, And the reality is, we also need to understand where that money's going. And that money should be going on things that have lethality capability, or a very minimum, logistic and resupply purposes. Because what you could have a situation is some European countries might try and bend these rules and claim they're spending money on the military. But they actually change it around. So, for example, let me think of an example. So they may say, right, we've got a lot of border guard, and our border guard actually come at the moment under Ministry of Interior. So we're going to change our border guard, and we're going to put that money under the military, and then we're going to add that money to our 2% GDP. So they're not actually spending any more money. They're just changing and shuffling things around, They need to be producing things with lethality in mind. And that's the only way. And guys, paradoxically, that's the only way for peace. And that's the reality. Because if Europe looks weak, then there's going to be more trouble. If Europe looks strong and ridiculously hard, there won't be any fighting because, the Russians will back down. But anyway, guys, how long have I been going? An hour and 6 minutes. Have you stayed with me for an hour and 6 minutes? Well done if you have. And if you've not done so already, guys, please like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate it when you do that. Let's try and get this thing online.